On the morning of November the 14th, 1886, the thermometer nailed beside the freight platform in Sage Hollow read 9 degrees at sunup, and still the church bell rope burned the sexton's palm through wool when he pulled it for first light prayers. Sage Hollow stood in the Wyoming Territory where the plain offered no shelter and no mercy, a settlement of 312 souls gathered around one rail spur, one church bell, and one main street of plank fronts that looked sturdy from 20 paces and thin as cratewood when the north wind found their seams. Smoke rose from stovepipes in quick gray ribbons, then tore sideways and vanished. By breakfast, frost lay on the inside of some window glass. By noon, children in the schoolhouse kept their gloves on to hold slate pencils steady. Winter there did not usually announce itself with spectacle. It entered through cracks. Roy Ramsey was 27 that season, broad-shouldered from field labor and long-armed from swinging a maul, with hands rough as rasped leather and a habit of stooping to retrieve what other men stepped over. Bent nails went into one tobacco tin. Cracked beans went into another. Stove ash he shoveled into sacks and kept dry for lye. Town boys called him a scavenger in tones meant to travel, and older men watching from hitch rails said he had inherited his father's stubbornness but not his father's luck. His father had broken 3 wheat crops in succession near the Platte River bottoms and buried his pride 1 acre at a time before fever took him in 1881. What remained in the Ramsey household after that had not been luck or land. It had been method. The method came from his mother, Miriam Ramsey, who had grown up where poor harvests were not stories but calendars. During 3 lean years along the Platte, she had taught Roy and his older brother Ezra to count winter losses the way merchants counted coins, not in dramatic ruin, but in small thefts repeated daily. She showed them how heat bled through 1-inch board walls at every knothole, how wet boots left too near a stove hardened and cracked before dawn, how soup thinned by 1 ladle each night became hunger by week's end. She taught them to dry bean mash on muslin in thin cakes for travel rations, to line root cellars with straw and tamped clay in alternating bands, to pack smokehouse walls with chaff so meat held its cure through January. When she died in the spring of 1884, Ezra kept the lease field and Roy kept her ledger, a cloth-bound book where she had written weather marks, storage tallies, and 1 line that Roy repeated when men laughed at his caution. Winter kills by inches. By the final week of November, Roy had begun taking his dawn walk past the schoolhouse before reporting to the Callaway field crew. The building sat on open ground west of the church, 40 feet long and 24 wide, framed in cottonwood studs with plank siding 1 inch thick and no sheathing paper beneath. The single iron stove stood at the center aisle with 6 feet of stovepipe, rising straight before elbowing toward the roof. On still days, the room warmed unevenly. On wind days, the floor near the east wall stayed cold enough that spilled rinse water held skim ice until noon. Teacher Eliza Thorne, who boarded with the Hale family and kept attendance in a careful copperplate hand, had already shifted the youngest pupils to benches nearest the stove, though it reduced writing space and crowded lessons. Twice that month, the gusts under the door had been strong enough to slide loose slates from back desks. Silas Kincaid, merchant and school trustee, dismissed those complaints as frontier inconvenience. He was a man of 42, heavy through the waist in a way that testified to steady meals, with tailored broadcloth coats shipped from Cheyenne, polished boots that rarely saw mud above the welt, and a gold watch chain that flashed each time he leaned across his counter. He kept the largest storeroom in Sage Hollow and the longest account book, and he spoke in the cadence of ownership even when matters were shared. When Roy's name came up around the Cracker Barrel, Kincaid would tip his chin toward the salvage sacks and say, loud enough for the back wall to hear, that worry had made a profession of him. Roy did not answer in the store. He answered behind the school at dawn, where frost cracked under his boots while he stacked cordwood in rows aligned to the building's west wall. He bought damaged loads when he could, and cut river bottom salvage when he could not, favoring cottonwood for bulk and pine for quicker catch in morning fires. Each billet he split to 16 inches, then squared by eye so courses would stack tight without rocking. He recorded volume by chord fractions in his mother's ledger and marked moisture by shaving a slice from random pieces each evening. The first row reached waist height by December 3rd. Children passing on the boardwalk began counting aloud. By the next week, 3 rows stood under canvas, ends painted with lime wash to slow checking. His plan, though uninvited, was precise. The schoolhouse needed an exterior shell that trapped still air and packed mass where the wind now ran free. Roy paced the perimeter with a surveyor's chain borrowed from Ezra and sketched a double wall standing clear of the original planks, paired courses of split logs with a 30-inch cavity between existing school wall and new outer face. That cavity he intended would be filled in lifts with straw, sawdust, and clay, each layer tamped hard so settling did not open channels. At the doorway he meant to build a short, enclosed passage, a windbreak vestibule deep enough for 2 children to enter together without giving the room a direct draft. He priced nails at 5 cents per pound, lime at $1.15 a barrel, wagon hire for sawdust at 75 cents per load, and made a separate tally for borrowed labor, even though he expected little of it. When he described this to Eliza Thorne one evening as she latched the school door, she listened with her gloved hands on the hasp and did not laugh. She asked how long such walls held heat. Roy told her earth and wood held what iron could not, that a stove fed steadily in a buffered room did not chase temperature all day, and that children learned better when fingers could bend. Eliza said only that the board would never approve private alteration on district property without a vote. Roy replied in a low voice that he would not touch district property until he had lawful ground beside it. Then he tipped his hat and hauled his sled of billets into the dark. 2 mornings later, at Kincaid's store, Roy requested 30 pounds of mixed nails, 2 lantern chimneys, and 1 gallon of lamp oil on account against spring labor. Kincaid weighed the nails, set them down, and said account credit would be reserved for productive improvements, not experiments that made a public building resemble a stockade. Men near the stove chuckled. One of them repeated the phrase by supper, and by the weekend, children were whispering their own versions behind their mittens, making sport of Roy's stacks as if he meant to wall the whole town. Roy loaded only what he could pay in coin, counted each cent from a folded kerchief, and left with less than half what his list required. He compensated with labor measured in hours and inches. Before sunrise, he split, stacked, and sorted by diameter. After field work, he reset marker stakes along the common side where no district fence stood, checking 6-foot intervals with the surveyor's chain, and correcting drift where wind or hoof had shifted a line. Ezra, who spoke little and judged by completion, drove over one Sunday with a spare singletree and watched Roy sight along the line. He asked whether the town would ever thank him. Roy kept his eyes on the plumb bob swinging in the wind and answered, "Let them call it what they please. Words do not hold heat." Ezra nodded once and handed him the chain. By New Year, the piles behind the school rose higher than a wagon bed, covered against snow in patched canvas and weighted with stone. Roy's ledger showed $11.80 spent, 4,320 billets split, and 47 evening hours put into groundwork no board had requested. The school bell still rang through draft and frost. Children still stamped their boots at first lesson. Across Sage Hollow, most households trusted the rail line to bring coal and trusted ordinary winters to remain ordinary. Roy trusted arithmetic, timber, and the memory of his mother's hand pressing his palm against a leaky wall, while she said that survival was rarely one grand act, and almost always 1,000 small refusals to waste what kept breath warm. In the first week of January 1887, the wind came hard from the northwest each morning, then dropped by supper to a stillness so complete that stove smoke rose straight as fence posts and held in the dark like ink on glass. That false calm made men speak loosely on the boardwalk, saying the worst had already shown itself in November, saying rail coal would arrive before any true deep cold, saying talk of structural work was worry looking for labor. On January 9th at 11 o'clock, the schoolyard snow had softened under a pale sun and dripped from the eaves. By 3 in the afternoon, the same drips had become needle ice. The thermometer at the freight platform fell from 18 degrees to -11 in less than 4 hours, and the weather changed character with such force that the bell rope at the church froze stiff between coals. Inside the schoolhouse, Eliza Thorne saw the shift first in small things and then in alarming ones. The blackboard ink in its well thickened until the nib scratched dry. A water pail near the east wall filmed over. The youngest pupils, seated nearest the center stove by her standing order, kept rubbing their hands together under desks, and 3 of them began to speak with the deliberate mouths of children trying not to cry. She checked cheeks and found white patches where color should have been. She checked fingers inside wool mittens and felt stiffness where warmth should have lingered. She closed the arithmetic copybooks where they lay, dismissed the upper pupils by household clusters, and walked the 3 youngest toward the Hale Lane herself. Shawl wrapped around all 4 bodies in turns as the gusts struck. No child was lost that day. Yet every adult who saw those white facial patches understood what had nearly begun. By dusk, lamps burned in the church meeting room, and boots stamped a floor tracked with frozen mud, while 63 voting householders crowded the pew aisles. The district clerk read the school levy balance in a thin voice. $74 remaining for winter contingencies. Kincaid stood near the pulpit rail in a dark coat with beaver collar turned high, watch chain bright against wool, and proposed immediate purchase of imported coal and a second cast-iron stove, freight priority to be requested at once from Cheyenne agents. Several heads nodded before he finished. He spoke of proven methods, central heat, and orderly budgeting, then turned his chin toward Roy and called improvised walling a hazard in deep weather. When Roy asked permission to describe an exterior double shell with packed insulation and a mud-plaster windbreak vestibule, Kincaid answered first and named it in front of all present: Ramsey's wood coffin. Laughter came in short bursts, less from joy than from the relief of a room that preferred familiar error to unfamiliar work. Roy waited for the noise to pass. Then he stated his measurements in the same even tone he used when reading seed tallies. Existing school walls were 1-inch plank over cottonwood studs with no sheathing paper. An outer log wall, standing clear, could break direct wind. A cavity of 30 inches, filled in compacted lifts of straw, sawdust, and clay, could hold heat through the night and cut fuel use by nearly half if stove cycling were disciplined. A vestibule 8 feet deep would stop door drafts from crossing the room in one blast. He would labor without district wage. He asked only for permission and access. The clerk called for vote by raised hands. 17 more hands favored Kincaid than favored Roy. The meeting would have ended there under ordinary custom, but Ezra Ramsey had attended from the back and did not leave when the tally was entered. He waited until the room thinned, then asked the clerk to read the boundary of district ownership around the school lot. The western strip, a narrow run of common ground, used mostly for wagon turn and ash dumping, lay under town lease authority, not school title. Ezra produced $1 in silver and a prepared petition for annual lease of that strip in his brother's name. By statute and under witness, the town recorder could not deny it without cause. No cause existed. Ink froze once in the recorder pen before the signature took. The lease was entered for $1 per year, renewable at clerk discretion. Roy did not gain permission from the board. He gained legal ground beside it. 3 days passed before the wind relented enough for layout work. At dawn on January 12th, Roy set corner stakes along the leased strip, 6 feet from the school planks at the nearest point, and 7 at the far corner where the lot widened, then ran mason twine to mark a rectangle that followed the building on 3 sides. He chose not to enclose the south wall at first because prevailing gusts struck hardest from north and west. His plan was not theatrical and not cheap. It was arithmetic under weather pressure. Billets stayed at 16 inches to stack true. Corner joints were saddle-notched by hand, so courses locked against lateral shove. Every 4th course he drove wrought spikes and cross-tied with salvage iron strap to resist drift load. Where gaps opened, he drove oakum and clay putty before the insulation fill began. He kept expenses in Miriam Ramsey's ledger under a new heading, school shell account, and entered every purchase before sleep. January nails, 11 pounds at 5 cents, 55 cents. 2 lime barrels, $1.15 each, total $2.30. 1 wagon load of mill sawdust from Timber Creek, 75 cents paid in coin. Straw from Hale threshing sweepings, 40 cents per bundled stack, 12 stacks purchased across 2 weeks. Lamp oil at Kincaid's revised shortage price, 19 cents per pound. Bought only when moonlight failed and work required late measuring. He marked also the labor that did not cross his palm as cash. Ezra with team for half-day hauling, value $1.25. Nettie Hale and 2 older pupils carrying dry chaff in gunny sacks after lessons, value noted as volunteer, no charge entered. By the end of January, the north wall stood shoulder high and the first insulation lift was tamped. Roy used a flat-faced rammer cut from elm, 10 pounds in weight, and compacted each 12-inch layer until boot heel left no deep mark. Mix ratios shifted with moisture. On dry days, he ran 2 parts sawdust to 1 straw chaff and 1 wet clay slurry. On colder days, when clay stiffened too quickly, he increased straw to preserve flexibility and reduce cracking. Every seam at window level received extra chaff, since thermal loss around frames was the quickest thief in night hours. Eliza Thorne observed each stage from the door after dismissal, and once, when a gust drove chalk dust from a sill in a visible stream, she said quietly that drafts taught physics better than textbooks ever could. Kincaid responded by turning social contempt into commercial pressure. On February 2nd, a notice appeared on store wall in his clerk's hand. No district liability for unsafe private modifications to public structures. A second line followed by afternoon. Credit withheld on non-essential construction materials until further review. Men who had laughed at the meeting repeated the phrase wood coffin with greater confidence now that it hung beside flour prices and freight schedules, and boys chalked a crude coffin shape on the board fence near Roy's wood stacks before Ezra washed it off with snow and a stiff broom. Roy answered with output. He added storm shutters hinged outward with leather strap. He built the entry tunnel in split log, 8 feet deep and 4 feet clear width, wide enough for paired pupils in heavy coats. He installed a drying shelf above flue height where mittens could rotate by seating row and hour. By the second week of February, the school stove consumed measurably less fuel on comparable cold days. Eliza, who had begun recording first bell and noon stove loads for her own certainty, counted a drop from 7 armfuls before shelling to 4.5 after the north and west sections were packed. Interior morning readings taken with a loaned alcohol thermometer hung at child height near the east desks rose from 24 degrees average at first bell to 33 on similar exterior mornings. The numbers were not comfort. They were margin. Fingers bent more easily. Ink flowed longer. Slates no longer slid from backbenches when the door opened, because wind now struck the tunnel, curled and weakened before entering the room. Roy's warnings about weather signs sharpened as spring approached. Geese had turned south early, he reminded those who would listen, and muskrat lodges stood unusually high at creek bends. 3 mornings in succession, halo rings around the sun had formed with crisp edges, and high cirrus had thickened from horsetails into veils by afternoon. A pattern Miriam had marked in her old pages as precursor to violent fronts. Kincaid dismissed such readings as farm superstition and told customers rail timetables mattered more than animals. Yet, even among those who mocked, habits began to bend. 2 households stuffed chaff into wall gaps. 1 ranch bunkhouse added a second door. Eliza requested extra mitten hooks and received them by donation from parents who had seen January with their own eyes. When March thaw came in uneven patches, Roy did not stop. He shifted from wall raising to seal maintenance and wrote procedures on a broad pine board mounted beside the school stove, plain enough for older pupils to read aloud. Feed small, steady splits, not large rounds. Bank embers with ash at final bell. Rotate drying shelf by row order. Check cheeks, ears, fingers at midday, and dismissal. Keep passage door latched against direct draft. These were not speeches. They were instructions built from hard seasons and from a mother who had measured survival by repeated small actions. Sage Hollow still used the mocking name on many tongues. But by then, every child entering the schoolhouse each morning passed through Roy's tunnel before stepping into class, and every one of them felt the wind lose its bite 1 door earlier than it had the year before. The following Monday, with thaw water still running in narrow silver lines along the schoolyard ruts, Roy marked the remaining perimeter with fresh stakes and began the section he had postponed through the worst wind because partial shelter had bought the children margin but not security. He set the south run first, where spring sun would strike and dry the outer courses too quickly if they were not shaded in the first weeks, and he altered his method to match what the first wall had taught him. Instead of filling the cavity only after shoulder height, he raised paired courses in 3-foot lifts, packed each lift while access was easy, then sealed the top with a clay cap before building higher. Settling dropped by half. Chink seams held tighter. Fuel use records in Eliza Thorne's notebook steadied, then improved. He was no trained mason, no carpenter from a formal guild, yet he worked like a man who understood that precision had moral consequence in a schoolhouse. A gap the width of a finger at floor height could cost warm feet to 6 children before noon. A hinge hung 1 degree off plumb could leave a tunnel door ajar all winter. By late April, he had added a low stone skirt around the base of the new wall, gathered from creek beds and set in lime mud, to keep spring runoff from wicking into the first timber course. Each stone was no larger than a bread loaf, each joint packed twice, once wet and once after partial cure. He left weep channels every 8 feet, marked with small cedar pegs, so trapped moisture had somewhere to go when freeze came again. On May 6, 1887, he entered 3 new lines in Miriam Ramsey's ledger. 1 second-hand adze head from Flint River, $1.10. 1 keg, cut nails, 50 pounds at 4 1/2 cents, $2.25. Wagon hire for lime and stone, $1 even. He drew a rule beneath those numbers and wrote the running total in careful block script, $23.90. Ezra, reading over his shoulder by lantern light, said the amount looked like folly beside a field lease payment. Roy answered that 1 field fed a family in favorable weather, while 1 warm schoolhouse preserved 20 families when weather turned against arithmetic. Ezra said nothing after that, but he brought his team twice that month without being asked, and hauled salvage timber from a collapsed sheep shed north of town. By the end of June, the east side stood enclosed as well, and the schoolhouse that had once sat exposed on open ground now rested inside a second body of wood and earth. Not elegant, but deliberate, its walls thick enough that two grown men could not touch hands through the packed cavity. Roy finished the roof transition by building a sloped flashing of plain boards from original eave to outer shell, then smearing the seam with a lime clay render mixed with chopped straw fibers for tensile hold. During a summer rain, Eliza stood with him beneath the tunnel lintel and watched runoff strike the outer face, bead, then drop clear without entering the cavity. She said the room no longer smelled of wet drafts and scorched mitten wool. It smelled of dry pine and chalk. By the second week of July, he shifted from structural work to system work, which most observers considered less visible and therefore less impressive, though it mattered more when panic began. He built a wood-rack ledger into the tunnel wall and painted marks for daily burn allotments under three conditions: ordinary cold, hard cold, and severe event. He reworked the stove brick bed so ash could be banked evenly at night without choking draft. He hung iron hooks along the warming shelf in numbered groups and matched the numbers to bench rows, so mitten rotation could occur without argument. He cut 12 narrow paddles from scrap plank and branded each with one letter: M for morning shift, N for noon shift, E for evening bank, and taught older pupils to hang the correct paddle when they loaded fuel. Order reduced waste. Routine reduced fear. Sage Hollow did not stop talking. At first, the mockery stayed where it had begun, around Kincaid's Cracker Barrel, and near the freight platform where men judged all risk by rail schedules and cash flow. Then, it hardened into something nearer policy. Kincaid began requiring cash payment, not account, for any household buying materials, for Ramsey-style alterations, and he posted that phrase in his own hand as if he were naming a contagion. Two widowers who had planned to add chaff infill to bunkhouse walls put the plan aside when the oil price on their account rose without explanation. A teamster who offered Roy scrap plank for tunnel shelving found his feed credit delayed for 10 days. None of this violated statute. All of it carried the same message. The school board meeting in August was worse in tone than the vote of January had been in outcome. Kincaid arrived with a folded statement declaring that district authority did not recognize private experiments as grounds for future levy requests, and he read each word slowly while glancing toward parents who had children in Eliza's room. The implication was plain. If fuel costs rose, if repairs became necessary, if any accident happened at all, blame would follow the man who had built without permission, rather than the trustee who had blocked him. One rancher laughed and asked whether Roy planned to put shutters on the church next and bury the bell in clay. Another suggested that if the winter proved mild, the whole structure should be sold for fence posts and the school returned to ordinary design. The phrase wood coffin passed again from mouth to mouth, now polished by repetition. Roy attended that meeting and did not argue after the first 3 minutes. He placed his ledger on the table, open to fuel comparisons and expense entries, and told the board they could inspect every receipt, every timber measurement, every labor note, then decide whether thrift was disorder. When no one reached for the book, he closed it, nodded to the clerk, and walked out into the dust with the same pace he used carrying water pails. Eliza remained long enough to state, in a voice that carried to the back pew, that student attendance had improved during cold mornings and ink had ceased freezing at midday. The clerk recorded her sentence. No action followed. By September 1887, social exclusion had moved beyond meetings into ordinary exchanges. Roy's name dropped from 2 communal threshing invitations. Boys at the hitch rail tapped his tunnel boards with sticks and asked whether coffins required windows. One woman, embarrassed while saying it, told him her husband had forbidden her from attending Eliza's stove lessons because Kincaid called them panic schooling. Roy answered none of them with sermon or accusation. He repaired what warped, resealed what cracked, and loaded another stack of split billets under tarred canvas before first frost. On evenings when the town street went loud from saloon songs, his workyard stayed dark except for a shielded lantern and the thud of a tamping maul. The next winter, 1887 into 1888, was severe but not catastrophic, cold enough to test structure and routine, not cold enough to force confession. That season gave Roy what argument never had, a second set of numbers. On 12 days when freight thermometer readings stayed below zero at dawn, the insulated school burned an average of 38% less wood than the church meeting room of comparable floor area and thinner walls. Eliza and 2 older pupils tracked classroom readings at first bell, noon, and dismissal. The lowest interior temperature, that winter was 34 degrees, reached once after a night wind snapped a chimney cap and delayed relighting. The children kept writing. No fingers whitened. Parents noticed and explained the change as luck, then as stove quality, then as one of those years. Few named the walls. By mid-May 1888, the plains turned dry in a way old farmers distrusted. Grass came up short, seed heads light, creek edges muddy where they should have run clear. Roy used the quiet months to extend his preparations beyond the school's shell. He repaired the tunnel floor with tamped gravel, so boots did not track slush into the room. He dug a shallow ash pit lined with stone for safer ember disposal during crowded shelter use, though no public order yet authorized shelter use at all. He bought damaged mason jars by the crate from a freighter clearing cracked inventory and sorted sound ones by ringtone, tapping each with a spoon to hear fractures hidden to the eye. Kincaid refused him standard lid lots on credit. Roy purchased mixed lids from passing wagon peddlers at inflated price and recorded each cent in the ledger, where the running total climbed to $46.05. 1 year had taught him structure. The second taught him timing. He watched birds and water and fur as closely as he watched ledgers. In the first week of September 1888, geese crossed south over Sage Hollow in ragged early wedges, higher and faster than usual, calling in long, thin lines before dawn. Men on the boardwalk looked up and called it an early turn that would likely correct. Roy marked the date in the ledger margin and said to Ezra that migrations did not hurry without reason. 10 days later, he rode to the creek bends and found muskrat lodges built high above ordinary bank line, domes thick with fresh cuttings, and mud worked in layers as if for flood and hard freeze together. On 3 consecutive mornings, a bright halo ringed the sun by breakfast and held until nearly noon, edges hard as coined silver. Miriam had written the same sign years earlier beside a notation for a killing front near the Platte. Roy carried those observations where warning might still alter habit. At Kincaid's store, he advised households to increase wood splits, patch boot seams, and set secondary door curtains before October. At church steps, he urged that the school tunnel be kept clear at all times and that a rope line be considered between the school, church, and nearest homes for whiteout travel. Some listened with polite faces and changed nothing. Others answered with the tired confidence of men who had not yet paid for their assumptions. Rail service had improved, they said. Coal orders could always be increased. Last winter had been hard enough to prove the point and mild enough to excuse further labor. Kincaid, focused on margin, made the choice that would later define him. He reduced his own winter coal order by nearly 1/3 from prior year quantity, expecting steady rail deliveries to bridge demand peaks, and redirected available cash toward lamp glass and imported dry goods that sold at higher return in ordinary weather. He told 3 customers within Roy's hearing that panic buying was for men who mistook signs in the sky for accounting. The remarks spread by supper and returned next morning in sharper form, with boys calling Roy cloud reader and old women shaking heads at Ramsey weather sermons. Yet one listener stood silent at the back counter, 13-year-old Nettie Hale, who watched her father laugh with the others and then looked toward the school tunnel with a seriousness uncommon in children. By late October, thin ice formed along shaded creek edges before sunrise and held past noon. Cattle coats came in heavy under clear skies. Winds shifted north 2 days running without the usual gradual turn. Roy set aside argument and moved to preparation that did not require permission. He sealed jars of beans and pork until his shelf count reached into the hundreds. He purchased oats whenever a sack could be had, below market peak. He checked every tunnel latch, every hinge strap, every shovel kept by the school door. He instructed Eliza to keep attendance groups by walking distance rather than alphabet, so release decisions could be made by route and exposure if weather broke fast. She agreed, then copied his cold check procedure in a second hand for substitute use. On December 1st, 1888, the freight platform thermometer read 23 degrees at dawn under a sky too clear for comfort, and Sage Hollow went about its trade with the confidence of a town that had mistaken one season of mercy for permanent order. Roy stood behind the school at first light, testing the packed wall with his palm, where no sun had yet touched it, and the timber gave back yesterday's stored warmth in a faint, steady pulse. He turned, looked over the open ground toward Main Street, and resumed splitting wood before breakfast. By noon on December the 3rd, 1888, the freight thermometer climbed to 41 degrees, and Sage Hollow exhaled as if a verdict had been reversed. Snow along the wagon ruts collapsed into gray slush, creek ice broke into slow plates, and men who had spent November muttering about hard signs stood outside Kincaid's store without gloves, remarking that the season had shown its teeth and then thought better of it. Roy watched the thaw water running under a skin of old ice and trusted it less than he trusted cold. Warmth arriving that suddenly in early December, carried on a south wind that smelled of wet earth, was not a reprieve in his accounting. It was a hinge. On December 4th, he moved from building to provisioning with the same plain urgency he had once given to wall seams. He hauled mason jars from his shed by the crate and boiled lids in batches, then packed beans and pork in quart measures until the shelf tally reached 240 sound jars, each marked in grease pencil with date and contents. He stored 18 sacks of oats in the school tunnel loft, where damp could not climb from the ground, and he set 2 barrels of water just inside the inner door, wrapped in old quilt batting so they would not freeze solid if the stove draft dipped at night. Eliza Thorne copied a new roster that grouped pupils by nearest shelter route, then pinned it beside the stove rules. At dusk, he began laying rope lines, one from school door to church rail, one toward the Hale Lane, and 3 more toward the nearest houses on open ground where a whiteout erased distance into guesswork. He drove chest-high posts at 20-foot intervals and tied bowline loops that gloved hands could find by feel. By December 6th, the warm wind had failed. The sky turned hard and metallic. High clouds spread in flat veils, and the barometer in Kincaid's back office dropped fast enough that even men who mocked weather signs glanced at it twice. Roy added 6 older pupils to stove and shelter drills after lessons, not as spectacle but as labor division. Nettie Hale, tall for 13 and steady with instructions, learned how to bank embers in ash and how to test fingers and ears for dangerous whitening without shaming the younger children. 2 boys from the upper bench practiced carrying kindling in measured lots, so the main stack stayed dry and ration counts stayed honest. Eliza timed each drill by lamp clock. The children completed a full room shift from lesson layout to sleeping pallets and back in 14 minutes. On December 8th, Kincaid refused once more to designate the school as official refuge, and told a cluster of fathers that panic planning created panic itself. He had cut his coal order in September to protect his margin, and now he held to the same arithmetic because admitting error would have cost him authority before the storm had yet arrived. His store still looked prosperous that afternoon. Shelves square with flour sacks, lamp chimneys shining in neat rows, bolts of imported cloth stacked high behind the counter. He spoke from that abundance with his usual confidence. Roy did not answer him in public. He tested every tunnel latch again, set kindling crates in numbered pairs, and slept in his coat beside the school stove. The first true blow struck before dawn on the 11th of December. At 4:30, wind hit the north wall in long concussive bursts that made the outer timbers groan like a loaded wagon axle. By 6, snow came sideways in a density that erased the church steeple from the schoolyard, though the two stood less than 90 paces apart. By 9, the freight platform thermometer read -22 and still falling. Classes had already been suspended by Eliza's order the night before, and families were told to hold in place unless they had rope access. That instruction lasted less than half a day. Roof felt peeled from 2 houses on the west edge before noon. One stovepipe blew free near the stock pens and left a family with no draft and no way to relight an open wind. Drifts climbed fence rails and then swallowed them. The storm strengthened into something beyond ordinary winter weather, not wind over snow, but force with intent, driving granulated ice through keyholes and under door sills, stripping heat from rooms faster than green wood could replace it. At sundown on the 11th of December, temperature reached -28. During the second night, it sank near -34 in the open lots east of Main Street where no trees broke exposure. The rail spur vanished beneath drifts deeper than a wagon wheel, telegraph lines sagged under rime, and every assumption in town that depended on resupply collapsed at once. Kincaid's store failed in stages. First, the roof shingles on the north pitch tore loose and rattled away into dark. Then snow began sifting through the exposed sheathing and melting against warm air near the stovepipe before freezing again along the rafters. By midnight of the first day, his rear coal bin was half empty. Through the second day, demand from frightened households and hard-drafting stoves drove his reserves down to the last usable shovels, with both bins running critically low by dusk. He had counted on rail freight and ordinary demand. He had prepared for neither interruption nor crowd. Families who had purchased small coal sacks from him in November burned through them in hours once draft began pulling hard through unsealed walls. By the 20th hour of storm, men were breaking kindling from porch rails and chicken coop braces. By the 30th, several houses had gone dark. By dawn of the third day, his bins were scraped down to fines and clinkers. The schoolhouse held because it had been designed for this exact arithmetic. Roy kept interior burn cycles small and regular, feeding split billets by schedule rather than fear. He posted 2 watches at all times, one at stove and one at door, and rotated sleepers in 3-hour blocks so body heat was conserved under shared blankets instead of lost in scattered rooms. The thick, packed walls did what he had promised 2 winters earlier. They absorbed daytime heat and gave it back slowly through the long black hours when outside air became lethal. Interior readings, taken at child height by Eliza every 4 hours, stayed between 46 and 52 degrees through the worst of the blow. That range was not comfort. It was survival. By midday on December 12th, the community cost became visible in names instead of numbers. Reverend Amos Pike left church shelter against repeated warning when word came that a fevered woman near the stock pens needed quinine, and the church cabinet held the only sealed bottle in walking reach. He clipped onto the rope line at the church rail and advanced by hand in bursts, head down, coat iced white at the shoulders. At the second post, the line snagged under drift pressure, and he unhooked to free it. He did not return. After the storm, they found him kneeling against the lee side of the church steps, with the medicine satchel still strapped across his chest, one glove missing. Beard rhymed solid. The quinine bottle was unbroken. That same afternoon, Teamster Jonah Wren attempted the half-mile run toward the rail sheds where he believed a medical trunk from Cheyenne might still sit under tarpaulin. He lashed it to his sled when he found it, tied canvas twice, and turned back into a crosswind that had deepened every old track. His mule lost footing on buried ruts and overturned the load. He was discovered after daybreak on December the 14th, braced against the sled tongue with both hands locked around rope, the medicine still secured under canvas exactly as he had tied it. Several doses from that trunk were used later for those who survived, and no one in Sage Hollow forgot the cost of their arrival. The third death came from delay measured in minutes. Lena Barlow, 8 years old, was kept home with her family beyond the Hale Lane while they waited for a lull that never held. Near the end of the second day, when the crossing had already grown worse, her mother tied the children into a rope party and started for the school tunnel. Lena's boot seams, cracked from prior wear, opened under driven snow within the first stretch, and ice water worked in with every step. They reached the line posts late and exhausted, crawling the last section when wind took their footing. Roy and Eliza got Lena onto a pallet, changed wrappings, and rewarmed her by stages. But the cold had traveled too far before she ever reached shelter. She died before dawn. Eliza recorded Lena's name and age in the same notebook where she had once written spelling scores. No sermon could have sharpened the lesson further than those 3 losses did. By evening of December 12th, houses nearest open ground had become traps, each one consuming fuel and returning little heat, each one demanding labor that exhausted the very bodies trying to endure. Hunger rose next, quiet but decisive. Kincaid had little left to sell, and what remained could not be cooked in homes where stoves had gone cold or draft had failed. The town's hierarchy, so rigid in meeting rooms, dissolved under weather pressure into one question repeated door to door. Where is it warm enough to keep breathing until morning? Help was sought first in fragments, then in a single movement. Thomas Hale reached the school tunnel at dusk with 2 neighbors on the rope and asked whether Roy would take another 6 souls from the west row houses where windows had failed. Roy answered by handing him a shovel and assigning him to post clearing. 20 minutes later, a ranch hand arrived carrying Kincaid's youngest son under blankets and asked for floor space near the stove. Roy pointed to the second pallet line and told Eliza to mark 1 more bowl on ration count. Near midnight, with the wind still hammering at the outer shell, Silas Kincaid himself came on the rope with his wife, 2 children, and a clerk whose face showed the waxy gray of deep cold. Kincaid entered bent at the shoulders, boots crusted to mid-calf, beard packed with ice where breath had frozen and refrozen. He did not begin with defense. He said only that his house stove had failed draft, and what coal remained was nearly gone. Roy did not make him repeat old words and did not request apology at the threshold. He took Kincaid's coat, set him by the inner wall away from direct stove blast, and gave instructions in the same tone he used for every arrival. Gloves off slowly. Boots loosened, not stripped. Warm broth first, then dry socks, then rotation to sleeping line C when pulse steadied. He assigned Kincaid's clerk to wood-splitting detail as soon as hand strength returned, and he assigned Kincaid's eldest child to mitten sorting beside Nettie Hale. In less than an hour, the merchant who had once governed school decisions by account leverage was carrying chamber buckets under Eliza's direction and counting ember shovels on the midnight watch. Through 62 hours of storm, More than 140 souls passed through that insulated shell in shifts, some for full shelter, some for warming and route reassignment along the ropes. Roy kept the ledger open on the stove table and entered fuel loads, jar counts, and oat measures with a carpenter pencil worn flat at one side. No entry included grievance. Each line measured only what remained and what must be done next. Outside, Sage Hollow was buried to the eaves in places, its fences erased, its rail links silent, its proudest storefront stripped down to need. Inside the schoolhouse, under walls built from salvaged wood and ridicule, breath held steady enough for dawn to matter. At first light on December the 14th, when the wind finally dropped from a scream to a hard, continuous shove, Roy opened the outer tunnel door in increments of 6 inches and sent 2 shovel teams into drifted white that stood chest-high against the north posts. He did not call the work rescue because that word invited haste. He called it route clearing, stove discipline, and measured movement between fixed points. Nettie Hale led the first rope detail to the church with Thomas Hale at her shoulder, each carrying a lantern hooded with tin, so flame could not gutter out in the residual gusts. Eliza remained by the stove table and turned her attendance roster into a shelter ledger, striking out names only when she had seen faces and checked hands herself. By noon, 167 souls had passed through the schoolhouse since the first blow, and 140 remained inside or in connected warm stations between school and church. Roy opened the provision shelves and changed rationing from emergency spoon count to structured meals by labor requirement. Children and the infirm received broth thickened with beans and pork at first bell, noon, and evening. Adults on shovel crews received oat mash with rendered fat at dawn and dusk, with 1 extra ladle if they hauled more than 20 loads from blocked doors. He set a fuel board beside the stove and marked each burn cycle by quarter hour. Small pine splits for ignition, cottonwood for steady bed, ash banking at shift change. Kincaid, who had once argued that coal and cast iron were the only civilized answer, now watched Roy stretch common cordwood farther than his own expensive stock had ever lasted. The contrast required no speech. One system had been bought. The other had been built. Before sundown, Roy gathered 8 older pupils and 3 adults beside the tunnel rack and taught them again how to read frostbite signs before they became injury. Pale wax patches on cheeks, fingers that stiffened without complaint, ears that lost pain because sensation had gone. He showed them where to place warming stones wrapped in cloth near, not on, cold skin, and when to stop warming and seek Eliza for watch care. He assigned Kincaid's clerk, whose hands had steadied, to mitten rotation by numbered hooks, and he put Kincaid himself on water thaw duty, breaking barrel ice skim with a wooden mallet every 2 hours so no one would have to chip a frozen block at mealtime. In that room, authority followed usefulness. By the afternoon of December the 15th, the sky cleared to a brittle blue, and the true scale of damage emerged. 14 homes had chimney failures, 9 had roof loss severe enough to force abandonment, and the rail cut east of the spur stood buried under drifts measured at 6 to 9 feet. Roy organized outward teams in pairs, each tied to a waistline with 30 feet between knots, and sent them first to occupied houses nearest open ground where walls had iced over inside. They brought back bedding, flour sacks, lamp oil tins, and 2 hens still alive under a collapsed coop. No one scavenged privately. Eliza entered every recovered item in a columned list and tagged each bundle by household name with slate pencil on scrapboard. On December 18th, after 3 days of clearing and shared shelter, the first inspection party from the rail section gang arrived from Timber Creek with 2 hand sleds and a note packet sealed in wax. One note confirmed that the freight priority request, filed the previous winter, had never been fulfilled, because no guaranteed allotment existed for Sage Hollow in severe interruption conditions. Another note stated that resupply could not be expected for at least 8 days, possibly 12. Kincaid read both aloud in the schoolroom before 30 witnesses, then handed them to Eliza for district record without argument. Roy added the dates to his ledger margins beside fuel counts. External promises were now documented against winter fact. When roads opened enough for wagon travel in the first week of January 1889, Sage Hollow did not hold a ceremony. It held work lines. Families came in pairs to Roy's yard at appointed hours, carrying notebooks, sacks, and questions they had once mocked. Roy set posts in the frozen ground and taught wall spacing with chain measure, 6 feet from existing planks where lot lines allowed, 5 where they did not. He demonstrated fill mixing on a tarp, 2 parts sawdust, 1 part straw, 1 wet clay slurry. Then had each pair tamp a 12-inch lift until a boot heel left only a shallow mark. He did not ask who had laughed. They told him anyway. A blacksmith repeated his own phrase from the store stove and said he had called the school shell a coffin for learning. A ranch wife said she had refused stove lessons because she believed caution shamed faith. Thomas Hale said he had laughed when Nettie first asked about rope lines, and that his laughter sat heavier now than drifted snow. The reckoning moved house by house and bench by bench, not as one dramatic confession, but as repeated admission tied to changed practice. Eliza required each household that sought instruction to bring its own measurements and fuel records from at least 1 week. So excuses could not hide behind fog memory. Men who had never counted wood beyond wagon loads began entering split lengths, burn times, and morning temperatures in pencil columns. Women who had managed kitchens through scarcity taught new arrivals how to rotate jars by date and inspect lids for false seals. Boys who had chalked coffin shapes on fence boards spent 2 Saturdays carrying straw bundles to insulate the church vestibule under Nettie's direction. By the 3rd week of January, the mocking name survived only as a cautionary echo, usually spoken by those correcting themselves. At the memorial roll call, the town named the storm dead without alteration. Reverend Amos Pike, Lena Barlow, age 8, and Jonah Wren. Kincaid came last. He arrived at dusk on January 24th. Coat plain, watch chain absent, boots unpolished for once. He brought Roy a folded ledger sheet from the store listing coal purchases, resale prices, and reduced order quantities from September through December, each line signed in his own hand. He placed it on the workbench beside Miriam Ramsey's book and said that numbers had been used as a shield for pride and as a weapon against caution, and that both uses had failed the town. He stated plainly that he had called the school wall a wood coffin, had denied material credit to households attempting similar work, and had treated weather signs as superstition because they came from a man he considered beneath him in status. He did not ask for quick pardon. He asked what duty remained that would be equal to the harm. Roy let silence hold for several breaths, then said his mother taught that forgiveness without changed practice was only weather talk, warm for an hour and gone by dark. He said he would not spend the winter measuring remorse. He would spend it measuring walls, fuel, and roots, because children required systems, not speeches. If Kincaid wanted to make repair, he could surrender school supply authority to district vote, open his books for freight oversight, and work under supervision where arithmetic could no longer be bent for margin in a hazard season. Kincaid answered that he would do so. He did. At the February district meeting, attended by 201 souls despite deep ruts and hard cold, the clerk read Eliza's shelter list, Roy's fuel ledger extracts, and the rail section notes confirming failed supply assumptions. The board voted to remove Kincaid from independent school procurement and reassign him to freight bookkeeping under a 3-signature rule. clerk, teacher, and one elected parent each month. A second vote established Saturday instruction at the schoolhouse with no fee, open to every household, and compulsory for any family seeking district fuel assistance. Roy taught the first session with Eliza at the table and Ezra at the wall mock-up. Lesson 1 was not carpentry. It was loss arithmetic. Heat leaks, wet boots, delayed crossings, and the cost of waiting for rescue that could not arrive. 3 days later, Kincaid appeared at dawn with a shovel and worked the post holes for the church insulation line until his palms blistered through gloves. No one applauded. They handed him another shovel when the first handle split. That was how Sage Hollow changed, not by sentiment but by repeated labor that made old hierarchies less useful than competent hands. By October 1891, the town of 326 souls had 3 insulated public structures: schoolhouse, church, and freight office warming room, each with double-entry windbreaks, fuel boards, and posted frost checks copied from Roy's first pine placard. Every autumn, students older than 12 ran rope drills between fixed posts before first snow. Communal grain reserves were counted by head, not by speculation, and stored in rotating lots with dates burned into crate ends. The district kept 2 ledgers in parallel, one for money, one for winter readiness, and neither was considered complete without the other. Kincaid remained in bookkeeping under oversight for years. He became meticulous in a quieter way, and never again spoke against preparation he had not measured himself. Roy never held office. He kept splitting wood, teaching Saturdays through spring, and adding notes to Miriam's cloth-bound pages until the spine had to be rebound with harness leather. When asked by newcomers who had not heard the old insults why he had opened his stores to those who had mocked him, he said only that warm rooms were built for breathing souls, not for winning arguments. Eliza Thorne copied that sentence to the inside cover of the school register in 1893. Decades pass. The outer cordwood wall at Sage Hollow still stands in repaired form, thicker at the north face where new courses were added after the storm of 1907, and children still file through a tunnel door before they enter winter lessons. The old phrase survives, transformed and clean of contempt. When hard weather gathers over the Wyoming plain and halos sharpen around the sun, families say it to one another while checking latches, jars, and rope knots. Build it Ramsey tight, then share it. One such morning came on January 6, 1892, when a pale ring hardened around the sun by 8 o'clock, and the school bell sounded once for lessons and once again for drill. And no one in Sage Hollow mistook the second ringing for alarmist theater any longer. Roy stood at the tunnel entrance with the old pine fuel board in his hands, the edges darkened by years of stove smoke, while Nettie Hale, now nearly 17 and serving as assistant monitor, checked mitten hooks by number and called each bench row forward in order. The children moved without jostling. The youngest kept one hand on the rope fixed along the tunnel wall, not because they were afraid, but because they had been taught that habit was stronger than bravery when weather turned mean. By noon, the wind struck from the north in blunt, hammering gusts that rattled the outer shutters, and the drill shifted into live shelter operations with Eliza Thorne at the stove table and Thomas Hale at the church line post. Families nearest open ground crossed in paired groups, each adult clipped to the guide rope with a loop knot that Roy had standardized years earlier. Inside, jars came down from the shelf in strict sequence by packing date, oldest first, and the 2 water barrels were skimmed every hour, so ice never locked the surface. The 240 original quart jars from the storm season had long since been consumed, but their method endured in duplicated rows, and that day, 96 replacement jars, beans, pork, carrots, and barley, were opened and recorded against head count without one argument over portions. Expensive cast iron in private parlors cracked when overfired. Imported coal and decorative scuttles vanished by midnight. The humble split billets kept dry, measured and fed on schedule, held the room between 47 and 51 degrees until dawn. 3 days after that blow passed, with roads still rough but passable by sled, the district held a winter covenant meeting in the church, and this time the crowd filled both aisles for a different purpose than accusation. The clerk placed 4 documents on the front table in plain view. Eliza's shelter ledger from December 1888, the rail section note packet confirming freight failure, Kincaid's signed coal and price sheet, and Miriam Ramsey's rebound weather ledger, open to the page where she had written winter kills by inches. No one touched the pages at first. They read in silence while stove iron clicked and settled. The reckoning moved by household, as the district had ordered, not to humiliate, but to make memory specific enough to govern practice. Abram Pike, nephew to the late Reverend, spoke first and repeated his uncle's final route and the reason he had gone out with quinine, then said that faith had never excused poor planning and that the church would maintain 2 medicine caches thereafter, one in sanctuary, one in school tunnel, with winter access checked weekly. Martha Barlow stood with her husband and named Lena aloud without breaking her voice, then held up the repaired small boots, seams now doubled and waxed, and said she had kept them not as relic but as instruction. Every child in her house now had 2 winter pairs by October, one in use, one drying, and she would inspect any neighbor child's boots at no cost if asked. Jonah Wren's brother Elias placed the medicine trunk inventory on the table, each vial listed, each dose accounted for, and stated that no life-saving supplies would again travel unescorted into open weather without rope, partner, and timed checkpoints. The room did not weep loudly. It listened with the stillness of souls who had learned that detail was a form of mourning. Silas Kincaid waited until near the end. Prosperity had left him invisible layers over those years, first in the sale of his store share, then in plain wool replacing tailored broadcloth, then in the way he stood, less spread through the chest, more squared like a laborer before instruction. He held no prepared speech. He read from his own old notice, copied word for word from the store wall. No district liability for unsafe private modifications to public structures, and let the sentence sit in the air as if it belonged to a stranger whose handwriting he now recognized with shame. Then he spoke to Roy directly, naming Woodcoffin without evasion, naming the credit denials, naming the 19-cent oil that had punished caution, and naming the children who had slept warm under the very wall he had mocked. He did not ask to be absolved. He asked to remain accountable in public books until the town judged otherwise. Roy did not rise immediately. He waited until the clerk had entered each statement, then stood with Miriam's ledger in one hand and the school fuel board in the other, old paper and old pine, record and practice. His voice carried as it always had, low but exact. My mother taught me that apology is weather unless it is nailed to routine. Warm words pass. Work remains. I did not build those walls to prove myself right. I built them because children do not bargain with wind. If you ask what I offer now, I offer the same thing I offered then: instruction, shared stores, and systems that any household can copy. If you ask what I require that memory be written, taught, and inspected, not once, each season. If that becomes forgiveness, it will not come from one sentence tonight. It will come from the winter after this one, and the one after that, when no child is left a chance because adults were too proud to measure. No one applauded. The clerk wrote every line. By the second week of February 1892, the covenant was tested in ordinary, grinding ways that made sincerity visible. Kincaid arrived before dawn to audit tunnel supplies with Nettie and accepted correction from her when his grain conversion totals were off by 2 pounds per 20 souls. Thomas Hale and Elias Wren reset 2 drift-bent rope posts and retied the bowlines to Roy's standard spacing. Eliza instituted monthly coal drills by route group and required each older student to teach one younger child mitten rotation and frost checks, so knowledge could not remain in one set of hands. The district also resolved every lingering store of contested property from the storm years. Recovered bedding and flour sacks were either returned to tagged households or entered as donated communal reserve by signed consent. The 2 surviving hens from the rescue period were sold in spring, and the proceeds purchased 24 new jar lids for public stock. The damaged lamp tins were emptied, cleaned, and converted into marked sand buckets for ember control. On March 18, 1892, the rail section foreman from Timber Creek came in person and read aloud his follow-up report to the board, confirming that Sage Hollow's freight status had been revised from discretionary to winter priority relay after repeated documented losses across the line. That external contact, once a thin note delayed by storm, now had outcome in ink and schedule. Even then, Roy told the room not to confuse improved freight with immunity. They entered the report into the district chest beside the older failure notice, 2 papers bound together by twine so future clerks would see promise and breakdown on the same pull. Years later, on November 2, 1907, another hard storm drove from the northwest and tested the town as brutally as any since the Great Whiteout. By then, Roy's hair had gone iron gray at the temples, Eliza wrote with spectacles low on her nose, and Nettie Hale kept the school keys at her belt as winter steward. The north face of the outer wall took damage where wind-scoured ice pried at old chinking, and 3 courses had to be stripped and reset under lantern light while children slept inside on assigned pallets. They did the repair in sequence exactly as Roy had taught in 1887, lift, pack, tamp, seal, and when dawn came, the interior held at 45 degrees despite the breach. Not one child froze. Not one elder was lost in transit. The wall did not stand because timber did not age. It stood because instruction did not. In the spring of 1910, when Roy finally laid down the mall after a fever season and did not return to Saturday classes, the district gathered at the school tunnel and fixed a cedar board above the inner latch where every entering child would brush it with a shoulder. Eliza chose the wording from his own meeting response, and Kincaid paid for the carving but did not place his name on it. The inscription read, "Warm words pass. Work remains. Build it Ramsey tight, then share it." Miriam's ledger, Eliza's shelter books, the rail reports, and Kincaid's confession sheet were wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a pine chest beneath the school platform, inventoried each autumn with fuel and grain, because memory there was treated as provision, not ornament. When halos sharpen now above Sage Hollow and the bell rings twice, children still take the tunnel rope in steady hands, and adults still count jars, knots, and billets before they count profit. And the old lesson holds with the plain force of lived fact. Winter can be met if wisdom is shared before the wind arrives.